You might think that just because Xenoblade is my favorite game series would automatically make Monolith Soft my favorite developer. Now, that's not true. They could have only made those 3 games, or only made those 3 games good and everything else was trash, and in that case, someone else who's either more consistent or has a bigger backlog of games they made would still be my favorite, even if the games they made weren't necessarily my favorites of all time. Thankfully though, we don't have to worry about that because Monolith Soft has made some of the best games in recent memory. Now yeah, this video is called Monolith Soft more than just Xenoblade, and oh yeah, they also made Xenosaga. Duh, they've clearly have more good games than just that, but we're gonna avoid some of the obvious stuff, and more focus actually on games that they worked on but didn't necessarily completely make or publish themselves, so this is mostly after the Nintendo buyout. But with that out of the way, I'm actually going to start off with the titles that they did do the majority of development on, so I probably shouldn't have said that first, but shut up, this is my video, I make the rules. If you know of Monolith Soft as a developer, you've probably played at least one of their big 3 kind of major pillar JRPG franchises. Obviously Xenosaga and Xenoblade, Xenosaga being the one Xeno series from the Namco era, and then Blade being the one from the Nintendo era, but around that same time they also made the Baten Kaitos series, which actually, while it only had 2 games, did come out during the time they were releasing Xenosaga, for the GameCube while Xenosaga was for the PS2, so it is kind of interesting that they were working through 2 companies at the same time while publishing through Namco and not Nintendo, because the second Baten Kaitos game came out in 2006, a year before the buyout. So it's just kind of cool that they had 2 big, relatively popular cult JRPG series going on at the same time, one per company. And in fact, the Baten Kaitos releases actually were sprinkled in between the Xenosaga releases. The original Baten Kaitos game came out after Xenosaga 1 and before the Xenosaga Freaks spin-off, which was a year before Xenosaga 2, and then the prequel, Baten Kaitos Origins, came out in between Xenosaga 2 and 3, and literally a week before the Xenosaga 1 and 2 compilation game for the original DS. Around that same time, they were also tapped by kind of their former bosses, Square Enix, to make Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII, which kind of brings the whole weird relationship that the Monolith Soft's team and Final Fantasy VII had, where Xenogears was originally a scrapped script for Final Fantasy VII that they didn't use because it was too dark, so they made it into Xenogears instead, but then they were tapped to make a Final Fantasy VII spin-off a decade later. It's kind of weird, but we're going to move on to that because in 2007, Nintendo bought the majority share of Monolith Soft and immediately put them to work on a little game you might have heard of called Super Smash Bros. Brawl. And this is the start of kind of a beautiful relationship where most Monolith Soft games would be published by Nintendo from then on, but instead of just making their own games and publishing them with them, they also worked together with some of Nintendo's more premier, well-known, centralized, like, super first-party studios to lend a helping hand on some of the biggest AAA releases Nintendo had, and you know, Brawl's a pretty big one. About a month later, they also came out with Somabringer, another just DS JRPG that I guess didn't really take off as much as either of their other 2 series, because, hey, it's a Monolith Soft series that actually only has 1 entry to date, which is kind of interesting. Around the same time, they also actually made 2 Super Robot Wars spin-off games for the DS, one in 2008 and one in 2010, and in between those, they had probably the most interesting licensed game they've ever done, Dragon Ball Z Attack of the Saiyans. Yes, in April 2009, Monolith Soft, the people who made Xenosaga, Baten Kaitos, and Xenoblade, were handed the Dragon Ball Z IP to make a turn-based RPG based off of the Saiyan saga. And from what I've seen, it's actually pretty good. It goes, basically the tutorial level is the final battle against Piccolo Jr. from the end of the original Dragon Ball, and then it also goes into the last filler arc. And then it goes into a very bloated version of the Saiyan Saga, the final boss just straight up being Vegeta. And it's actually really interesting. It's one of the last straight up turn-based RPGs that Monolith Soft has ever made since they moved on to the Xenoblade series, which is very not turn-based, as you probably know. And I really want to play this one sometime. I do definitely want to get a physical copy once one of my 3DSs has been repaired, because for all accounts, it's actually pretty good and was considered one of the best Dragon Ball games up until Fighters came out. And, well, if you say Fighters is the best, then Attack of the Saiyans is still one of the best. I just think it's really cool that they got this license for some reason. It's one of the weird, like, Avengers Infinity War was the most ambitious crossover of all time. Japan, hold my beer. Here we have Dragon Ball Z in your Monolith Soft, which, hey, Monolith Soft tends to work on the Smash games, because, spoiler alert, they also worked on Smash 4 and might be working on Ultimate as well. So, if you want your Goku in Smash, there might actually be a possibility through Monolith Soft. But anyway, after the second Super Robot Wars game they worked on, then in June 2010, for Japan at the very least, because obviously it came out a lot later in America, was the original Xenoblade Chronicles. But that wasn't the only first-party Nintendo game they were working on at the time, because in 2011, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword was released. And yes, this was the beginning of Monolith Soft's collaboration with Nintendo's big Zelda team, and they've actually been working on the Zelda series ever since. The only game since then that they haven't touched was Triforce Heroes, which I'm pretty sure was handled by a completely different development team from A Link Between Worlds anyway, and just used the same engine. And this actually really surprised me, because the only Zelda game that they've worked on that very obviously had their fingerprint on it was Breath of the Wild, because, you know, really big overworld with a lot of things to do, JRPG elements, very long game with nice side quests and stuff, good world building. It's like the Xenoblade Chronicles X of the Zelda series. So yeah, that one was obviously Monolith, but seeing as how they did Skyward Sword, which is one of the more linear games, is pretty interesting, though I guess it kind of comes with the territory of having worked on more traditional, slightly more linear JRPGs like the Xenosaga series in the past. In 2012, and then later on in 2015, they also worked on the Project Cross Zone games. Now, back when they were with Namco, they worked on Namco vs. Capcom, a crossover strategy RPG between various Namco-held and Capcom-held properties, and of course they threw Cosmos in there. I think Xion might have been in there as well, but in Project Cross Zone, every character operates in a pair. Not every franchise gets two characters, so you sometimes have things like Dante and Dimitri, but because Monolith Soft worked on it, they were able to get two Xenosaga characters in there again, and you got Cosmos and Telos working together for the first time before Xenoblade 2. Now, Project Cross Zone was pretty interesting because it didn't only have Capcom and Namco like the original Namco Cross Capcom. It also had Sega properties, which was pretty interesting. And since this was a 3DS game, and so was the sequel, they decided to, hey, let's throw in some Nintendo characters later on. So, in the sequel, Monolith Soft got to exude their own nepotism, and a very spoilery Xenoblade Chronicles 1 character replaced Telos as Cosmos' partner, and we also got some throw-ins from another pretty popular 3DS tactical RPG with Chrom and Lucina as another pair of characters. After this, or after the first Cross Zone and before the second one, they also worked on Animal Crossing New Leaf. This one I actually knew about before I started researching for this video because of a certain little side comment in a Chega Conroy Let's Play of New Leaf, so that I knew about, but it's really cool seeing just how many genres they can do, and they can do well, especially because they returned to strategy, but in a much more real-time format, with the next first-party Nintendo game they worked on, Pikmin 3, which, hey, arguably the best game in the series, one of the best games on the console, probably my second favorite Wii U game after Xenoblade X, which is, you know, pretty high praise if I say I like something almost as much as a Xenoblade game. And wow, big surprise, it was worked on by the same developers, which might just be why I like it so much. if anything, I can actually see them having expertise to work on a real-time strategy RPG like Pikmin 3 more than a life sim like New Leaf. Because, well, the Xenoblade battle system, just in all the games, does have a very light strategy aspect to it, and it's a very real-time, not necessarily twitch reflexes, which even Pikmin isn't to an extent, but it's a strategic, cerebral, real-time type of thing, and the puzzles are in the environment and not in how you're taking down the enemy. That's the main difference. Plus, they also have a pretty good pedigree of strategy games with Project Cross Zone, Namco Cross Capcom, and the 2 Super Robot Wars spin-offs. Later in 2013, A Link Between Worlds came out, and then in 2015, Xenoblade Chronicles X came out in Japan in April. Of course, the West had to wait until December, but we only had to wait 1 month for another Monolith Soft-developed Wii U game, being the original Splatoon. I didn't know about this either. I must not have paid attention to the credits of it when I first beat the single player very much, because I knew they worked on 2, and they did also work on the Octo expansion, which is phenomenal. It's probably the best single player I've ever seen them do, because honestly, my favorite part of Pikmin 3 is the multiplayer and mission mode and bingo battle, so I'm kind of not counting that, but the Octo expansion of Splatoon 2 is a purely single player experience, and if you could buy it separately like you can Torn of the Golden Country, I would have done it, because it's just that good. It's some of the tightest single player action game I've ever played in my life, and the fact that they managed to push the mechanics of Splatoon's multiplayer that far for basically a collage of pretty short but really intense and really difficult single player levels is phenomenal. And I don't have enough respect for them. I don't have enough words to say how much respect I have for them for doing that. So it's really cool to see them take on also a purely multiplayer endeavor. And with the whole Pikmin thing in there, if the reason that Pikmin 4 hasn't come out was because Monolith was working on 2 Xenoblade games that came out after Pikmin 3, 2 Splatoon games that came out after Pikmin 3, and Breath of the Wild, I'm much less inclined to complain. They also worked on Happy Home Designer, and that kind of makes sense, same engine, sort of thing. And then in 2017 was pretty much the best year Monolith Soft has ever had. Breath of the Wild, Splatoon 2, and Xenoblade 2. Out of the 4, like, holy godlike pillars of the first year of the Switch's lifespan, the only game that they aren't credited for development on is Super Mario Odyssey. And even that embraces some of their open-ended design philosophy, so I'm kind of counting that as like 20% of a credit in there. I don't know. It's just phenomenal how much work they've done, and honestly, before I started this video, I was like, okay, yeah, they're Nintendo's best developer because they've worked on some good Nintendo games, and also the best franchise, or, well, my favorite franchise. I can't say it's the objective best. I'll start working on that, don't worry. But then after this, quite frankly, they made the Wii U era of Nintendo still passable and worth being a fan of the company, virtually single-handedly. Plus, they had the biggest hand in the Switch's first year being as good as it was out of almost any development team besides, like, Nintendo EAD themselves. So, there you have it. If you're just a general Nintendo fan in this day and age, even if you hate the Xenoblade series as a whole, you probably still have Monolith Soft to thank. And so, until next time, this is Luxon, signing off.